Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me today is Paul Starr. He is the co founder and co editor of The American Prospect. He's also a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton. He's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction and the Bancroft Prize in American History. He's also written 8 books, including his most recent, which is American Contradiction, Revolution and Revenge from the 1950s to now, and that just came out in October. Thank you so much for being here, Paul.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Susan.
Well, following the 2024 election, I think a lot of us were left asking, how did a country that twice elected Barack Obama go on to elect Donald Trump twice? I think this really goes to the heart of what a lot of people on the left broadly have been agonizing over. And I understand that that kind of helped inspire you to write this book. So I'm going to ask you, Paul, how exactly did this happen?
The central motivating question of the book is exactly the one that you have put your finger on. How was it that this country came to elect Barack Obama, a black man? Many people thought a black man could not be elected president. And then how did we elect Donald Trump, somebody who also many people thought could never be elected president? And there, in a nutshell, is the American contradiction. The America of Obama, the America of Trump. Both of them, however, expressions of deep social and historical forces in the United States. So not just aberrations, not just accidents, but really related to important, long-standing aspects of American society.
I know that you argue that America's divisions stem from an enduring contradiction between a changing people and a resisting nation. So, can you talk with us a little bit about how
Yes.
you think that contradiction, really manifests itself today?
Yeah, well, let's start with the basic premise of the book, that the United States was born in a contradiction between freedom and racial slavery. And that contradiction has never entirely come to an end. The legacies of racial slavery continue. We live with them. But what I argue in the book, and this book is a history of the country since the 1950s. So that subtitle, Revolution and Revenge, from the 1950s to now. Uh, we were in the mid 20th century, um, gripped by a series of movements, beginning with the Black struggle, um, which challenged the old hierarchies of American life. And the Black struggle, I argued, I say that Black people were, in a way, a model minority. Not in the same sense as Asian Americans, but a model minority, a model for contesting old forms of social subordination. And they became a model for other ethnic and racial groups that also hadn't been given equal rights and equal respect, but also a model, too, for the women's movement, for the gay rights movement, um, challenging these old bases of subordination in American life. And it's not surprising that set off a reaction, that triggered a backlash. And what I'm arguing in the book is it's more than a backlash. It's a kind of fundamental disruption. You use this phrase from the book, the idea that we have had a changing people and a resisting nation. And by a changing people, I mean that we've had changes in the way people think about themselves, about their identity, about their rights. We've had infusions of new immigrants. We've had younger generations, and I say particularly of women, who have different ideas about their lives from the ones that their parents or grandparents had. And so there've been these enormous changes in the American people. But on the other hand, um, we have a kind of resisting nation. So we
Mm.
have a nation with institutions. Our Constitution dates from the 18th century, um, and in many ways, it's a very difficult to amend Constitution. Um, and we have a Supreme Court, which in the mid 20th century sought to advance revolutions in rights and race and gender, but today has reverted to the idea that, well, we need to stick with the original meaning, with the history and tradition of the Constitution, a period when um, Black people and other racial minorities and women didn't have any say in politics. So this is the clash. This is the clash, I argue, and it's as a contradiction between a changing people, a resisting nation, and a
Mhm.
nation with entrenched institutions that have made it very difficult to adjust, to
Mhm.
change, and a lot of people are scared of the changes that um, those movements set in motion.
So, at, during the founding of our country, almost 250 years ago, so we made the fundamental decision to continue with slavery, not end it. And citizenship was reserved for white men. And that was part of the founding of the country. And today we see that there is a segment on the right that seems to think that things should have stayed in some fashion, with that at its center. It seems to me that for the last couple centuries, our country really has been defined by the struggle over who really deserves full rights and citizenship, because those questions were uh, left somewhat unanswered at our founding. And
Yeah.
we fought a civil war over it, but we still have conflicts rooted in that today. So how can our country fully move forward when so many of these conflicts have yet to fully be resolved?
Yeah. So I would just say that um, so at the founding, um, general principles, the language of the Declaration of Independence, um, and many of the ideas that were implicit in the Constitution um, uh, really were contradictory to slavery. We didn't have a consistent set of principles and institutions. And the founding era was the era when slavery was eliminated in the North. In the years immediately, it was during and right after the American Revolution. It took a while in some states, but and many of the people involved in the founding of the country, including some of the slaveholders, really believed that slavery would just vanish. That they did not. This is before the cotton gin, before the development of plantations that really benefited so greatly from slavery. So there was, I think, a sense at the founding that slavery, at least among many people, that slavery was going to turn out to be a temporary
Hmm.
blemish on the country, which, of course, didn't prove to be true, and it did end in civil war, um, and um, it was immediately after the war those Reconstruction amendments, um, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that actually introduced the idea of equality into the Constitution that had not been plainly and
Right.
unambiguously expressed
Right,
in
because it was life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, not liberté, égalité, and fraternité like it was during
yeah,
the French
yeah,
Revolution.
yeah, yeah. And so this was a long-standing contradiction. It was not
Mhm.
like you know Uh, so, so, um, so what happened in the mid 20th century? We have a succession of movements that really tried to put equality into practice, that tried to bring to an end these longstanding forms of social domination.
Mhm.
And we made a lot of progress. I really want to emphasize the first half of the book is called American Revolutions of the 20th Century.
Mhm.
And they're really it is remarkable how ambitious an undertaking um, many Americans undertook with that, with the civil rights movement, with the women's movement, and I'd say even especially with the gay rights movement. So in the case of the civil rights movement, people often refer to the second Reconstruction because there was a first Reconstruction 100 years earlier. And with feminism in the 1960s and 70s, people say second wave feminism because there was an earlier
Right.
movement to give
The
women
the
the vote.
suffrage movement.
Yeah, but the gay rights movement was totally original. Really,
Mhm.
there was no earlier precedent for it. So this was a remarkable effort to achieve social equality. But this was happening or began in an era when economic inequality was growing
Mm.
and when the country was undergoing economic transformations that undercut the livelihood of millions of working people. And in a way, this is the kind of tragic historical coincidence that we've been living through. That um, we're trying to create greater social equality at a time when economic inequality was growing. And the result was many people felt they were at the losing end.
Mhm.
And it's not surprising that they would blame the groups that were making advances at the time, even though that didn't necessarily have to be true. And the origins of the loss of security for working working people, those were really quite different, I think. But um, um, so let me just get to the second half of this book.
Mhm.
The second half is called Sleepwalking into Revenge.
Mhm.
And I suggest that, for example, in supporting free trade agreements,
Mhm.
in supporting deregulation, many Democrats and many centrist Republicans went sleepwalking into revenge, went sleepwalking to their political funerals. In fact, they did not understand that the consequences would often undermine their own interests, their own
Mhm.
political interests. Um, in fact, I'd say that particularly of the moderate Republicans who supported a lot of these things, they didn't realize that in many areas they would be blamed
Mm.
and um, um, they would lose they would lose control of their party.
Mhm.
And the centrist Democrats who supported these things didn't realize that they were going to lose areas of the country, in the Midwest, for example, where industry declined and their working class base lost confidence that those Democrats were looking out for their interests.
Mhm.
So so this that sleepwalking. So I what I say is the people involved in the civil rights movement
Mhm.
and in the women's movement in the 60s, they knew there was a risk of a backlash. They understood that. But a lot of other people involved who made changes in policy really didn't have any idea in retrospect. I've gone back to congressional hearings.
Mhm.
So, for example, the 1965 hearings on immigration reform.
Mhm.
And it's fascinating. Um, there you have Senator Ted Kennedy at the first hearing on the immigration bill in 19. So this is the immigration bill that was going to open up immigration and the old national origins quotas,
Mhm.
and that dated from the 1920s, and that had greatly limited Southern and Eastern European immigration. And the main groups agitating for change were Catholics and Jews. who had been discriminated against in that immigration legislation.
Hmm.
But Kennedy said at the very beginning of the hearing, and I think I've got his words exactly right, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset.
Hmm.
And why? Why won't it be upset? Well, because the immigration bill included strong preferences for relatives of American families. And they thought, who are the existing families? It's going to be more of the same people.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't realize that some of the other provisions would open up immigration to people from outside of Europe. They had no expectation at all, going back to these hearings, that there would be significant Asian immigration. They had no expectation about more Latin America. In fact, the 65 bill was the first legislation that put a cap on Latin American immigration. There actually had been none before.
Hmm.
But the way these things evolved over time drastically changed who immigrants were.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying this was a bad thing. I'm just saying people didn't really understand repeatedly. I go through this repeatedly. They just didn't grasp what the consequences would be. And they certainly didn't understand how the reaction would build up against themselves.
Right. When I just wanted to go back when you were saying that with some of the progress in the 60s and 70s in terms of race and gender, that there were some people obviously who felt like they were on the losing end of those changes. Obviously, we've seen the Southern strategy develop, for the Republican Party. It is alive and well today with Donald Trump's politics. He's extraordinarily explicit in who he considers to be real Americans and who isn't, and who is
Yeah.
worthy of rights and who isn't. He says the quiet part out loud now. And so it's not just a matter of, this general feeling of discomfort. I mean, you have now a political party, the Republican Party, that is actively stoking this division and benefiting from it. How does this differ with where we're at now with today's Republican Party versus where we were back in the time of the 60s and 70s?
I'm so glad you brought this up, because the history of the Republican Party is actually, this is a good part of the book, is concerned with it. And so we go back, you mentioned the Southern strategy. It's associated with Richard Nixon. And although Nixon courted the South and he courted the forces of backlash, talked about law and order and so forth, his policies in office were actually not just moderate, but surprisingly liberal. And so I go through this in some detail. It was under Nixon that school desegregation in the South took place. Despite Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision in 1954, not much happened in the South until the Nixon administration. And Nixon quietly engineered a lot of the integration that took place in the South. It was under Nixon that affirmative action was introduced. Under George Shultz, the Department of Labor, the so-called Philadelphia Plan, the first time that there was any federal enforcement. Now, the term affirmative action had been introduced under Johnson, but actually very little had been done. It was Nixon who actually carried it out. Nixon, of course, approved the environmental legislation, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. I could go on. It's a long list. And if Nixon had been successful, so he had a national health insurance plan. He was competing at that point with Ted Kennedy on health care. He had a more generous national health insurance program than any subsequent Democrat dared endorse. Plus, he tried to pass, this was partly the inspiration of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who at that time worked for Nixon. He tried to pass a nationally guaranteed income. Imagine that. So
Right.
Nixon did court the forces of backlash to get elected, but
Hmm.
the winds were still blowing at that point in a liberal election, in a liberal direction, and so and Nixon's court appointments, and he wanted to move the court in a more conservative direction, but they weren't nearly as conservative as the ones made later. And so, it's a more complicated picture. And I'd say, in the case of Reagan, so Reagan is usually described as his election as the triumph of conservatism.
Hmm.
But there were actually liberals in the Reagan administration and a lot of moderates in the Reagan administration. Reagan approved Martin Luther King Jr., as a national holiday. That there were a lot of concessions, compromises. Um, so economic inequality was growing through this period, but
Hmm.
there really wasn't a reversal. This is the important point. Neither Nixon nor Reagan, certainly not Ford, and not even George H.W. Bush, really sought to reverse totally the new precedents that had been established during the 1960s and many of the policies. Um, for example, that affirmative action order in the federal government that was initially adopted under Johnson, but I said carried out much more under Nixon. Uh, that lasted all the way through Reagan. It
Hmm.
lasted through both of the Bushes. It was finally withdrawn by Donald Trump, not in his first administration, but
Right.
in his second administration. So this is an example of how the Republican Party was not really fully committed
Hmm.
to undoing all of those changes until Trump too.
Hmm. Yeah, I know you describe Nixon as being temperamentally Trump, but substantively liberal, which is fascinating. I know a lot of people would, disagree with you on that
No.
characterization, but I know that that is something that you spend a lot of time arguing in your book about, backed up with
Hmm.
so much evidence. But I'm wondering if, given the times where, Nixon um, did win a close election in 68, and there were a lot of winds of change, with
Hmm.
various social movements, if he felt that, he was co-opting some of that energy,
Hmm.
as opposed to it being, something that was a deeply held belief. And one thing that I have wondered with where we're at now with Donald Trump, where, he is so completely explicit about reversing progress. If
Hmm.
we got to this point because all along there were many conservatives, especially, people on the right, big power brokers who felt like that would be a bridge too far. So it's best to use the coded language, like during Reagan, of the welfare queen, where you don't say explicitly who it is, but everybody knows who it is. And you push ever so slightly with so that nobody can say you're racist because you have plausible deniability. But Trump kind of ripped off the Band-Aid and said, call me whatever you want. I don't want certain people in this country. I'm going to deport them. I don't want certain people to have rights. And this is my vision for the country. Deal with it. That was more palatable than a lot of conservatives ever imagined it would be. I'm just wondering if.
Yes, yes. I think you're accurately describing what happened. I think one of the discoveries that Trump made that others hadn't dared attempt was that by using open language, not coded language, and
Mhm,
by often being openly offensive,
mhm,
um, he could awaken people who didn't vote regularly,
right.
who responded and who said, well, here's somebody who's saying what I believed all along. And
Mm,
nobody else had the courage to do that. And so they are more loyal to Donald Trump than to any other Republican. Not, I mean, they think he's the one who broke through and spoke the truth from their point of view. And so, in a sense, he never had the inhibitions. He doesn't seem to have any inhibitions, and so that has a kind of shock value. I talk about this in the
Mm.
book. Um, it's a little bit like a shock jock on the radio or a shock comedian. It's like
Yeah.
saying, and a lot of people find it funny too. It's like it's almost like an act, but it's an act that has incredible political power. And I guess what people thought before is that um, it would cost more votes than it would pick up,
Right.
and instead Trump showed, no, actually, I can pick up votes, uh, and won't lose as many as you may have thought. Now, in fact, what was happening in this period is, and this had begun before Trump, is that the college educated were tending to move toward the Democrats, and the
Mhm.
non-college were tending to move to the Republicans. It had begun right around 2000, late 90s, 2000. You can see the trend emerging. So it's before Trump. But Trump really brought it out. And there's this big shift. Now it's everybody knows about it. It's a huge change with working class whites moving into the Republican Party and the college educated moving toward the Democrats. And it confuses the old assumptions about where the votes were coming from for Democrats and Republicans.
Right. And I'm very curious because we've now seen this an established pattern that there is a very different Republican electorate that shows up when Donald Trump is on the ballot and when he's not. And we just saw that on Tuesday, where Democrats did quite well and Trump was on the ballot, and he even tweeted out, "Hey, don't blame me, I was on the ballot, not my fault." But there will be a post-Trump era. And what does that mean for the Republican Party in terms of keeping those voters and possibly winning back, some of their older coalition? It seems like we're in a period where it's one of instability for both parties and what their coalitions are going to look like.
Yes. So I think Republicans shouldn't assume that if subsequent presidential candidates take the same policy positions, they will necessarily get the same support.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's this other aspect to Trump, the shock tactics, the way he could get the irregular voters to turn out. That's very different. But really, as I said, it's been a long-term pattern, the changing votes. It did precede Trump, so it won't disappear on the morning after.
You wrote an article recently in the American Prospect where you were, comparing your most recent book to another American Prospect founder, Robert Reich, former secretary. And I was curious because, you state that, your premise is you don't reduce the story to economics. And so, you have highlighted the timing of, the various movements for rights, for race, sexual identity, gender. And, obviously, as you said, it coincided with the long decline of working class livelihoods. So if for Democrats, as they're moving forward, how do they balance those two issues in terms of social equality and that value, but also making sure that they have policies that really speak to working class voters, more economically populist policies, like certainly the ones that Robert Reich advocates for? Where's
Right.
the balance there?
Well, I do think they can do both things.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are many examples of candidates who have done both things. Um, so you mentioned Bob Reich, an old friend of mine, also, as you mentioned, co-founder of the American Prospect, and we also both served in the Clinton administration at the beginning, in the first term. Bob in the far more important position of Secretary of Labor, and I was involved in the White House effort to reform healthcare that did not succeed. Uh, and um, and so our views at that time were very close, um, and Bob has over the years moved a good deal to the left of the views that he had. At the time he was associated with Bill Clinton, and and so I think Bob in his memoir didn't um, fully explain to readers why he changed. And so I mentioned what he had written in an earlier memoir, uh, when when he had supported the North American Free Trade Agreement,
Right.
NAFTA in 1994, and so what I the reform I was involved with, the healthcare, didn't work out. Many of us have to acknowledge we didn't fully understand at that time what the right thing was to do to make progress. I believe that we had a good plan for healthcare, but it wasn't a good plan politically. It didn't. We weren't able to pass it, and so it's partly a matter of kind of acknowledging that a lot of us got things wrong at different states. And one theme that I try to bring out in the article that you mentioned and that reflects the book is um, the tension, the conflict that existed between the unions on the one hand and many of the new movements that developed in the 1960s, especially the civil rights movement, the feminist movement. So both of those were fighting the unions because of a history of racist and sexist practices in many unions, and there were lawsuits, and some of those resulted in very expensive settlements by the labor unions because of past discrimination, and those weakened the unions. And there were other fights involving environmentalists on the one hand and unions on the other. It was a long list of conflict. And during that period, progressives and the Democratic Party generally um, did not really support the unions very strongly. In fact, I say during the many years when Democrats had big congressional majorities, they didn't pass a single law to help private sector union organizing.
Right.
And labor legislation got very much out of date. So we have labor laws that go back to the 1930s. They make certain assumptions about the economy, and those no longer fit the economy because the law hasn't been adapted. And it partly didn't get adapted when Democrats had the choice because of all these other conflicts that took place. So partly what I'm saying here, and it's partly what I think Bob Reich didn't acknowledge, is that it's not just that like Reagan and conservatives opposed the unions. It's also that there was this conflict within the Democratic Party.
Right.
And so Democrats actually weren't that effective and united in supporting the unions. And the long-term decline of unions, I think, has had a huge impact on the politics of working people.
Yes. I happen to be in Michigan, the birthplace of the UAW, and I mean, we can see here just the incredible decline of political power of unions and what that's meant for people's standard of living and on the impact of the Democratic Party and its politics. I just wanted to clarify. Obviously, there's nothing in conflict, with having progressive social policy and progressive economic policy, but it does seem that there are certain politicians like Bernie Sanders, who I know, your friend Bob Reich, that is probably his role model for a politician now, and many people feel that way. He emphasizes economics over everything else. And then when you have like a candidate like Kamala Harris, the nominee in 2024, where she was trying to reach the balance of, I think she did run a very economically populist campaign, but probably in part because of her own personal identity, being a woman of color. A lot of people only seem to hear her politics in terms of social policy, which ended up turning off, some more of those, traditional white blue collar voters. And it does seem to be a real conflict for Democrats about how
Yes,
to speak this language that gets through to those voters.
I agree with you, and it's tragic in a way that a black woman like Kamala Harris wasn't able to get across how much passion she felt about the economic issues, even though she talked about them. Um, it just didn't get communicated, and identity is it just influences the way people hear candidates. The
Mhm.
candidate may be saying one thing, but if the voters see one thing, they may not hear the words.
I really, it's such evocative language that use, sleepwalking through the 90s. And, I know for a lot of Democrats, the 90s were such a golden time where we finally had Clinton elected and temporarily a Democratic Congress. And, there seemed to be some progress being made, certainly after the Reagan era, where it seemed like the party was in perpetual decline. But there were so many compromises that were made with NAFTA and with not strengthening unions. And the Telecommunications Act of 1996, I think, turned out to be far more consequential than anyone thought that it would be in terms of where our media is at today. And I know you have also written, on the Jimmy Kimmel conflict and the American prospect and where we're at with media today. So I thought that might be a good place to, for us to end up here. And if you might want to talk a little more on that front.
Yes, so that 1996 Telecom Act included these fateful words. I think there are 26 words that basically freed what were then thought of as internet intermediaries, so the platforms, what we now, that freed them of any liability. And that has, that has helped, I think, degrade a lot of what's happening online. So, yeah. So, but talking more generally about media, and this is a theme that runs through the book. There's a lot about media at kind of each stage, and we have seen a long-term decline of newspapers and magazines, um, organizations that had traditional ideas about editorial responsibility, about accountability, about fact checking, and the emergence of new platforms online that have never had any tradition about accountability, editorial responsibility. And that shift has undermined um, adherence to fact in the public realm. Um, and and I think that is just another dimension of the shift that's taken place in the recent years. I'm not sure how we're going to get back. But so you mentioned this article that I wrote about about the Jimmy Kimmel case, but more generally um, about the transformation, the big corporate transformation that's taking place, both with tech and with media. And it involves this issue of what's called media capture, where this is a term that first came up in connection with Hungary and Turkey, where you have um, regimes that don't actually close down the newspapers. They don't shut down the TV stations. They work with oligarchs
Mm-hmm.
who are close to them in taking over the media. And so you got media capture. The media are still private, they're nominally independent, but they actually work closely with the government.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what I am very concerned about, and we should all be concerned about, in connection with the tech companies that have cozied up to Trump, and connection with the takeover with the CBS, likely CNN. This is now a tremendous change that's taking place in our media, and we're going to, I think, lose a lot of the traditional values that we've gotten from a free press.
Right. And that's in addition to an extremely robust and well-funded right-wing media, that has existed and only grown stronger, from Fox News all the way down. But now this, I think that the sea change where we're seeing these traditional media companies and of course social media companies, X, Facebook, being owned by right-wing figures, or at least people who are willing to acquiesce to Trump, creates this environment where there are some bright shoots like independent, media outlets. I'm proud of what we do here at Lincoln Square and with others, but, the major media companies, the corporations that still dominate the marketplace, are increasingly in lockstep with this administration.
Yep. And it's an international pattern. So again, it's not really an aberration. It really fits in with a lot of other things that are happening in the world.
Paul, I can't thank you enough for being here and sharing all of your insights with us. I want to put your book up once again. It's American Contradiction, Revolution, Revenge from the 1950s to now. It's available now. It just came out last month. And Paul, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's been a delight, Susan. Thank you.